Continuing on with multiplication, when we look at the first one, sometimes students think this is a little tricky when you're multiplying by 1, but really all multiplying by 1 does is get you right back where you started. So I can write it out the way that I've done other problems, where I'm seeing it as 1 times the first term x plus 1 times the second term positive 2, or really I should just write a 2 in here. When I do that multiplication, 1 times x just gives me x, and 1 times 2 gives me a positive 2. So really, I'm right back where I started in this parentheses, because anything times 1 just gives you itself. For the second problem, I'm doing 9 times x plus 10, so that's really 9 times the first term, x, plus 9 times the second term, 10. When I do this multiplication out, 9 times x gives me 9x, 9 times 10 gives me 90. For the third problem, I'm taking 7 from the outside, multiplying it by 5x. Then I'm adding to that 7 from the outside being multiplied by negative 3. 7 times 5 gives me 35x, and then 7 times negative 3 gives me negative 21. In problem number 4, I'm taking this negative 8, I'm multiplying it by the first term x, then I'm taking the negative 8 and I'm multiplying it by the second term 1. Negative 8 times an understood 1x, well negative 8 times 1 is negative 8, and then that x stays with it. Negative 8 times positive 1 also gives me negative 8. So my final answer is negative 8x minus 8. For problem 5, I'm doing negative 1 times 2x, so negative 1 times the first term 2x, and then I'm adding to that negative 1 from the outside times the second term, positive 6. When I do that out, negative 1 times 2x, really multiplying negative 1 by anything, just keeps the same number but changes its sign. So I get a negative 2x. Negative 1 times a positive 6 gives me negative 6, for a final answer of negative 2x minus 6. In problem number 6, I'm taking the negative 6 from the outside, I'm multiplying it by a negative 4x, and then I'm taking the negative 6 and I'm multiplying it by a positive 1. A negative times a negative gives me a positive, so I'm going to start with a positive number, where 6 times 4 gives me that positive 24. It's not negative because when I multiply two negatives, I get a positive. That x stays with the first term. When I go to do the second term, a negative 6 times a positive 1 gives me minus 6. In problem 7, the first term 10x is being multiplied by x, and then in the second part, we have that same 10x from the outside being multiplied by a positive 3. Whenever we do x times x, it's that exponent situation where really we're doing x to the first times x to the first, so we end up with x to the 1 plus 1, or x to the second. This is an understood 1x, so when we multiply the coefficients, 10 times 1 gives me 10, then x times x gives me x squared. When we do the second term, 10 times 3 gives me a positive 30, and then I have that single power of x that stays. Where really we know this has an understood x to the 0, so we're doing x to the 1 plus 0. That's how we end up with x to the first, or just x. For problem number 8, we're taking 3x from the outside, multiplying it by the first term x, then the 3x from the outside, multiplying it by the second term 2. 3 times an understood 1 gives me 3. X times x gives me x squared. Plus 3 times 2 gives me 6. Single power of x just leaves me with the single power of x. In problem number 9, I'm taking this negative 6x, multiplying it by the first term 3x. I'm adding to that the negative 6x times the second term 5. When I do negative times a positive, I get a negative answer. Specifically, 6 times 3 gives me a negative 18. X times x gives me an x squared with that term. Then I have a negative 6 times a positive 5. When I do a negative times a positive, I get a negative. 6 times 5 gives me 30. So I wind up with negative 30. I have this single power of x, which stays attached to that term. It gives me my final answer, negative 18x squared minus 30x. In problem number 10, we have the negative 8x out front being multiplied by another negative 8x as the first term in the second parentheses, and then we're adding to that a negative 8x being multiplied by a positive 1, which is the second term in the first parentheses. A negative times a negative is going to give us a positive. 8 times 8 is going to give us 64. So the first term is 64x squared, because x times x gives us x squared. The second term, we're taking a negative 8 times a positive 1. That gives me negative 8. And I'm keeping that single power of x. So my final answer is 64x squared minus 8x.